Watch this space. Assad meeting with Erdogan linked to Turkish withdrawal and stopping support mercenaries. Assad stressed the possibility of holding a meeting with Erdogan is linked to Turkiye's withdrawal from Syrian territory and stopping support of mercenaries. Bashar al-Assad stipulated during a meeting with a Russian agency that a meeting took place between him and Erdogan, Turkey's withdrawal from Syria, and stop supporting terrorism. Al-Assad explained that with regard to meeting with President Erdogan, this is related to reaching a stage where Turkey is clearly ready and without any confusion for the full withdrawal of Syrian lands and to stop supporting terrorism and restore the situation to what it was before the start of the war in Syria. Then there can be a meeting between me and Erdogan. Otherwise, what's the value of this meeting, and why do we do it if not achieved final results for the war in Syria? These Assad statements came after the first unreasonable visit to the Russian capital, Moscow, during which he met Russian President Vladimir Putin. Al-Assad concluded his visit to Moscow with a statement issued by the presidency of the Republic in which he said, Assad and Putin dealt with strategic relations between the two countries and based on the principles, interests, common values that bring them together, and the work to strengthen these relations in the interest of these two peoples in a stage that witnesses unprecedented transformations worldwide. During an interview with the Russian agency in response to a question about the possibility of increasing the number of Russian military bases in Syria, Assad said, the perception of the military bases should not be linked to the issue of combating terrorism. The fight against terrorism is currently existing, but it will be temporary, and the Russian military presence cannot in any country. It's based on a temporary thing. We're talking about an international balance. The presence of Russia in Syria is related to the balance of power in the world. He added, we believe that the expansion of Russian presence in Syria is a good thing that serves the idea, and if this expansion in other countries, perhaps in other regions, will serve the same idea, then we say that this is something that may be necessary in the future. He continued, today, the great countries cannot protect themselves or play the role from within their borders. They must play the role from outside their borders, through allies present in the world or through military bases. Economically, Assad said Russia and Syria will sign an economic cooperation agreement in the coming weeks, and each project will be considered and approved separately. Al-Assad added, the projects are now reviewed and the agreement will be signed later within a few weeks, but this item's been left to estimate each company and every project, and each project will be evaluated separately, and this is part of the monitoring mechanism for the implementation and success of projects. According to Assad, the Joint Committee discussed a number of projects during the talks that took place in Moscow during the past days. After signing the agreement, these projects will be announced, and after that, interested companies can apply to participate in these projects, Al-Assad said. And from Digital Journal, Putin hails Assad ties at talks with Turkey mend brewing. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday was hosting Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad for talks as the Kremlin seeks to mend ties between Damascus and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The meeting follows the surprise announcement last week of a Chinese brokered restoration of diplomatic ties between the Middle East major rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ties between Erdogan and Assad were severed after the outbreak of fighting in Syria, and successful Kremlin mediation would give Putin diplomatic clout with Russia, isolated internationally over the Ukraine conflict. We're in constant contact and our relations are developing, the Russian leader told Assad as the televised start of the meeting, hailing significant results in the fight against international terrorism. Assad, who arrived in Moscow on Tuesday, voiced support for Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine and said the visit would mark a new facet in his country's ties with Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov earlier told reporters the talks would focus on bilateral ties, but said Turkiye-Syria relations will certainly be touched upon in one way or another. Syria's civil war in 2011 strained relations between Damascus and Ankara, which has long supported rebel groups opposed to Assad. Turkiye severed diplomatic ties with Syria soon after the war began. Analysts say Moscow now wants to bridge the divide between the two countries that see a common enemy in Kurdish groups in northern Syria described as terrorists by Ankara and backed by Washington. Assad-Erdogan meeting? Erdogan's indicated he could meet with Assad, and their defense ministers met in Moscow in December in the first such talk since the Syrian war began. Diplomats from Russia, Turkey, Syria, and Iran are due to meet in Moscow this week to pave the way for a foreign ministers' meeting, according to Turkish media. Complex questions need to be resolved, however, particularly around the presence of Turkish troops in northern Syria. Assad's government's been politically isolated since the start of the war, but's been receiving calls and aid from Arab leaders after a February earthquake that killed tens of thousands in Turkey and Syria. The Syrian people faced another very serious problem, a catastrophe, an earthquake. As true friends, we're trying to support you, Putin said at the start of their meeting on Wednesday. After the quake, Putin offered Russian aid to Turkiye and Syria. Damascus is a staunch ally of Moscow, which intervened in the Syrian conflict in 2015, launching airstrikes to support the government's struggling forces. With Russian and Iranian support, Damascus won back much of the territory it lost in the early stages of the war. The Syrian war has killed around 500,000 people and displaced millions more since 2011 with the brutal repression of anti-government protests. Assad last visited Moscow in September 2021 when he also met Putin. And from Gulf Today, we'll have to read this with a critical eye. Syrian President Assad offers support to Putin in Ukraine conflict. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad on Wednesday offered Russian President Vladimir Putin his support in the conflict in Ukraine. In a televised meeting with Putin in the Kremlin, Assad said Russia was fighting neo-Nazis and old Nazis in Ukraine, according to a Russian translation. Without offering evidence, Assad said the West had taken in old Nazis and was now giving them support. I mean, what evidence do you need? What evidence do you need? This is what I'm talking about. I may make it through the next couple of paragraphs of this, but if I feel offended in any way, I'm definitely going to point it out, and I may stop. Kiev and the West say Russian accusations that Ukraine had become a hotbed of Nazism and Russophobia are a baseless pretext for an unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine. This is an opinion piece, and I'm not reading it. Okay, so let's see. The Moscow Times. Putin eyes rapprochement between Syria and Turkey at Assad meeting. Russian President Vladimir Putin hosted Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad for talks on Wednesday as the Kremlin sought to mend ties between Damascus and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The meeting follows a surprise announcement last week of Chinese-brokered reestablishment of diplomatic relations between Middle Eastern rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ties between Erdogan and Assad were severed after the outbreak of the civilian war, and a successful Kremlin mediation would lend Putin much-needed diplomatic kudos at a time when Russia's increasingly isolated over its invasion of Ukraine. We're in constant contact and our relations are developing, the Russian leader told Assad at the televised start of their meeting, hailing significant results in the fight against international terrorism. Assad, who arrived in Moscow on Tuesday, voiced support for Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine and said the visit would mark a new facet in his country's ties with Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters earlier that his talks would focus on bilateral ties, but said that Turkey-Syria relations will certainly be touched upon in one way or another. Russia sending aid to Turkey, Syria after devastating earthquake. The start of Syria's civil war in 2011 strained relations between Damascus and Ankara, which has long supported so-called rebel groups opposed to Assad, and led Turkey to sever diplomatic ties with Syria soon after the war began. Analysts say Moscow now wants to bridge the divide between the two countries, both of whom see Washington-backed Kurdish groups in the northern Syria as a common enemy. Erdogan's indicated he could meet with Assad, and their defense ministers met in Moscow in December in the first such talks since the Syrian war began. Diplomats from Russia, Turkey, Syria, and Iran are due to meet in Moscow this week to pave the way for a foreign ministers' meeting, according to Turkish media. Complex questions need to be resolved, however, particularly around the presence of Turkish troops in northern Syria. Assad's government's been politically isolated since the start of the war, but He's been receiving calls and aid from Arab leaders after a February earthquake that killed tens of thousands in Turkey and Syria. The Syrian people faced another very serious problem, a catastrophe, an earthquake. As true friends, we're trying to support you, Putin said at the start of their meeting on Wednesday. After the quake, Putin offered Russian aid to Turkey and Syria. From irishivideos.com, Assad visits Moscow for talks on Turkiye-Syria ties. Helping to restore ties between Turkey and Syria offers the Kremlin an opportunity to accumulate diplomatic leverage as Moscow becomes increasingly isolated from the West after sending troops to Ukraine. The meeting follows last week's surprise announcement of the restoration of diplomatic ties between the Middle East's main rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran, but between the Chinese. And again, I'm at the point now where I really can spot these really early. This language that is biased, and so just the use of the term Middle East here is problematic. And then pitting Saudi Arabia and Iran against each other as main rivals when that's an arbitrary juxtaposition. I'll continue here, and if there are issues, I'll let that's what this is all about. We have to unpack it. We can't just read it blindly, right? So
let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Iran, Saudi Arabia to restore relations in China mediation. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that the meeting between Putin and Assad, who arrived in Moscow on Tuesday evening, was due to begin at around 12 GMT. At the forefront of the talks are bilateral relations between Syria and Russia, Peskov said, adding that Turkey-Syria relations will certainly be touched in one way or another. Syria's civil war broke out in 2011, has strained relations between Damascus and Ankara, which has long supported so-called rebel groups opposed to Assad. Turkey has severed diplomatic relations with Syria soon after the war began, but experts have said Moscow wants to bridge the gap between the two countries, which see a common enemy in Kurdish groups in northern Syria described as terrorists by Ankara and backed by Washington. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has recently indicated he may meet with Assad to discuss reviving ties, and their defense ministers met in Moscow in last December for the first such talk since the Syrian war began. Diplomats from Russia, Turkey, Syria, and Iran are due to meet in Moscow this week, according to Turkish media. Assad's government's been politically isolated since the war began, but he's received calls and aid from Arab leaders since an earthquake in February that killed tens of thousands in Turkey and Syria. Damascus is a staunch ally of Moscow, which intervened in the Syrian conflict in 2015 and launched airstrikes to support government forces. Putin hails Assad ties at talks with Turkey mend brewing. And this is from channelnewsasia.com. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday was hosting Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad for talks at the Kremlin seeks to mend ties between Damascus and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The meeting follows the surprise announcement last week of Chinese brokered restoration of diplomatic ties between major rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ties between Erdogan and Assad were severed after the outbreak of fighting in Syria, and successful Kremlin mediation would give Putin diplomatic clout with Russia isolated internationally over the Ukraine conflict. We're in constant contact and our relations are developing, the Russian leader told Assad as the televised started the meeting, hailing significant results in the fighting against international terrorism. Assad, who arrived in Moscow on Tuesday, voiced support for Moscow's military campaign in Ukraine and said the visit would mark a new facet in his country's ties with Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov earlier told reporters the talks would focus on bilateral ties, but said Turkey-Syria relations will certainly be touched upon in one way or another. Syria's civil war in 2011 strained relations between Damascus and Ankara, which has long supported rebel groups opposed to Assad. Turkiye severed diplomatic ties with Syria soon after the war began. Analysts say Moscow now wants to bridge the divide between the two countries that see a common enemy in Kurdish groups in northern Syria described as terrorists by Ankara and backed by Washington. Putin hosts Assad for talks in Moscow. Russian President, this is from internationalnews.com, actually thenews.com.pk. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday was hosting Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad for talks as the Kremlin seeks to mend ties between Damascus and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This meeting follows a surprise announcement last week of Chinese brokered restoration of diplomatic ties between the Middle East's major rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ties between Erdogan and Assad were severed after the outbreak of fighting in Syria, and successful Kremlin mediation would give Putin diplomatic clout with Russia. We're in contact with our relations, and our relations are developing, the Russian leader said. Erdogan's indicated he can meet with Assad, and their defense ministers met in Moscow in December in the first such talks since the Syrian war began. Diplomats from Russia, Turkey, Syria, Iran are due to meet in Moscow this week to pave the way for a foreign ministers' meeting, according to Turkish media. And from Al Jazeera, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad said that he would welcome any Russian proposals to set up new military bases and boost troop numbers to the Middle Eastern country, suggesting Moscow's military presence there should become permanent. When Russia intervened in the war in Syria in 2015, 4 years after protests began in the country, it helped tip the balance in al-Assad's favor, ensuring the Syrian leader's survival despite Western demands that he be toppled. Al-Assad, who met President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin on Wednesday, has supported Moscow's war in Ukraine and told Russia's state news agency RIA that Damascus recognizes the territories claimed by the Kremlin in Ukraine. Syria, al-Assad said, would welcome any Russian proposals to set up new military bases and boost Russian troop numbers, and said they need not be temporary. We think that expanding the Russian presence in Syria is a good thing, al-Assad told RIA in an interview published on Thursday. Russia's military presence in any country should not be based on anything temporary. We believe that if Russia has the desire to expand bases or increase their number, it's a technical or logistical issue. Al-Assad's years as president have been defined by the conflict that began in 2011 with peaceful protests before spiraling into multi-sided conflict that's fractured the country and drawn in foreign friends and enemies. He's retaken territory from the opposition with the help of Russia and Iran, but all three have been accused by human rights groups of crimes. War crimes specifically, alongside the Maimim air base from which Russia launches air attacks in support of al-Assad. Moscow also controls the Tartus naval facility in Syria, its only naval foothold in West Asia. It's been in use since the days of the Soviet Union, and Russia's defense ministry said in January that Russia and Syria had restored the Al-Jara military air base in Syria's north to be jointly used. The small base east of Aleppo was recaptured from Islamic State fighters in 2017. In Moscow, al-Assad thanked Putin for the help Russia had given to Syria after last month's devastating earthquake. Syria stood beside Russia on the issue of Ukraine, al-Assad said. Because this is my first since the start of the special military operations in Ukraine, I'd like to repeat the Syrian position in support of this special operation, al-Assad told Putin, according to a Kremlin transcript. Syria recognizes the territories of Ukraine which Russia has seized, as Russian al-Assad said. I say that these are Russian territories, and even if the war had not happened, these are historically Russian territories, he told RIA. Russia's claimed about a fifth of Ukraine and says the lands are now part of Russia. Ukraine says it'll fight until every last Russian soldier is rejected from Ukraine. The West says that annexation of Ukrainian territory is illegal. Al-Assad said Russia and Syria plan to sign an agreement on economic cooperation in the coming weeks. And from Frontier India, Assad okay with Russia deploying hypersonic missiles in Syria as the U.S. struggles in the Middle East. The president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, believes that Russia's military involvement in Syria should not be considered temporary or restricted to countering terrorism. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad arrived in Moscow on March 14th and met with this top friend, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a 3-hour meeting. And concerning the political element, the question of military bases and countering terrorism should not be connected at all. The struggle against terrorism is the focus of today's conversation, but this focus is only transitory, Assad told RIA Novosti, adding that there's no reason for the Russian military presence in the country to be based on anything that is merely temporary. We say about the international balance and the presence of Russia in Syria is important, it's of importance related to the balance of power in the world as a country located in the Mediterranean Sea, Assad said. In response to a question on the prospect of deploying hypersonic missiles, Assad stated that Russian military bases in Syria should get the most advanced weapons to overcome threats. He said that the distinction is in the caliber of weaponry, but the underlying idea remains unchanged. According to him, it goes without saying that if one intends to establish bases, one should not make those bases vulnerable from a tactical strategic standpoint. It's only natural and reasonable that bases should be armed with the most powerful weaponry possible to fulfill their intended function as a deterrent or a balancing force. Assad stated that the fundamental idea is of course the same regardless of whether the weapons in question are hypersonic missiles or any other type of more sophisticated weapon in the present or the future. As they are only present within their own state territory, he believes that today's superpowers cannot define themselves or play the role that's rightfully theirs on the international scene. They should do it outside of them through allies in the world or through bases, the Syrian president added. In June 2021, 2 Russian MiG-31K planes capable of carrying hypersonic Kinzhal missiles were deployed for the first time to Syria's Kemeim airfield. If Moscow establishes bases in Syria, it'll pose a challenge to the U.S., which is losing its influence in West Asia due to rising competition from Russia and China. The U.S. involvement in Syria has been hotly debated, with some claiming that it's only made matters worse for ordinary Syrians, while others believe that U.S. must do more to aid the Syrian opposition and shield civilians from the brutality of the Assad dictatorship. The U.S. has also been accused of stealing oil from Syria, particularly in areas controlled by Kurdish forces in the northeast. In 2019, President Donald Trump publicly stated that the U.S. was keeping the oil in Syria and would use it to help fund the military presence there. The U.S. has also agreed that its legal basis for maintaining a military presence in Syria under the authorization for the use of military force passed by Congress in 2001. Critics of the U.S. presence in Syria argue that the oil-related activities are illegal and violate international law, as well as harm Syria's economy and the well-being of its people. They also argue that the U.S. focus on oil and military intervention in Syria is driven more by geopolitical interest than humanitarian concerns. However, supporters of the U.S. presence say that it's necessary to prevent the re-emergence of Islamic states and to support local partners in the region. In contrast to his position on the U.S., Assad says he trusts Russia. We trust the Russian side, as it's played the role of a mediator to facilitate these contacts, while within the framework of the foundations on which Russian policy is based. Respect for international law, acknowledgement of state sovereignty, rejection of terrorism, respect for Syria's territorial integrity and sovereignty over its land and the necessity to withdraw illegal foreign armed forces from Syria are among these pillars, according to Assad. To this end, Russia is working with Syria, attempting to resolve the sites in Geneva, Astana, and other cities. All these negotiations have one goal: to restore stability in Syria, Assad stressed. Russia is Assad's principal supporter and a large presence in Syria, where a 12-year uprising turned civil war has killed about 500,000 people and displaced half of the country's pre-war population. Moscow has played a critical role in combating armed opposition organizations attempting to destabilize Assad's administration by providing military backing. It's also aggressively supported Damascus against UN opponents. From the start of the war, Moscow has increased its military presence in Syria by establishing a permanent air station at Hamaymim in Syria's Latakia region. Russia's naval facility in the Syrian seaport, located in Tartus City on the Mediterranean coast, is the Russian Navy's only permanent warm water port, outside of the former Soviet Union. And here's the meeting with Assad and Putin.
Уважаемый господин президент, очень рад вас видеть в Москве. Мухаммад Раис, المحترم سعيد جدا برؤيتكم هنا في موسكو. Спасибо, что приняли наше приглашение.
وشاكرين على تلبية هذه الدعوة.
Мы находимся в постоянном контакте.
ونحن على اتصال دائم.
И наши отношения развиваются.
ونشهد تطوير علاقاتنا.
Благодаря нашим совместным усилиям и решающему вкладу российских вооруженных сил в Сирии достигнуты существенные результаты в борьбе с международным терроризмом.
وبفضل جهودنا المشتركة وبفضل كذلك للمساهمة العامة من قبل القوات المسلحة الروسية تم تحقيق نتائج ملموسة فيما يخص لمعارضة ومقاومة الإرهاب الدولي.
Это дает возможность стабилизировать социально-экономическую и внутриполитическую ситуацию.
وهذا يتيح فرصة لتحقيق أكثر من الاستقرار في الوضع الداخلي وكذلك الاجتماعي والاقتصادي في السورية.
Но, к сожалению, сирийский народ столкнулся с еще одной очень серьезной проблемой, с катастрофой, землетрясением.
ومع الأسف الشديد فإن الشعب السوري واجه مشكلة إضافية وهي متماثلة بالكارثة من الزلزال المؤخر.
Это, конечно, усугубляет ситуацию.
وهذا يزيد سوءا للوضع.
Мы, как настоящие друзья, пытаемся вас поддержать. Здесь, как вы знаете, работали и наши подразделения по линии Министерства по чрезвычайным ситуациям, представители вооруженных сил, борьбу с последствиями землетрясения.
overcoming the consequences of the earthquake. نقوم بكل ما في وسعنا لمساعدة وتسهيل المعاناة للشعب السوري ولقد قام تقديم مثل هذه المساعدة على مستوى وزارة الطوارئ الروسية والقوات المسلحة الروسية وكذلك الذين هم متواجدون في سوريا.
Несмотря ни на что, тем не менее, наши отношения развиваются, в том числе и в экономической сфере. За прошлый год зафиксирован 7% рост.
وبرغم كل هذه المساعد نشهد تطوير بعلاقاتنا الاقتصادية وفي نتائج السنة الماضية يمكننا أن نسجل زيادة 7% من الحجم التبادل التجاري.
И в следующем году мы отмечаем 80-летие со дня установления дипломатических отношений.
في السنة القادمة فسوف نحتفل بذكرى 80 لإقامة علاقات دبلوماسية بين البلدين.
Сегодняшнюю нашу работу я предлагаю провести два этапа. На первом этапе вместе с нашими коллегами с обеих сторон.
أما جدول الأعمال هذا فاقتراح مني أن نفصلها إلى جزئين، الجزء الأول بمشاركة الزملاء من مختلف الوزارات والهيئات.
И затем уже у нас будет возможность в ходе рабочего завтрака поговорить уже тет-а-тет.
وبعد ذلك الجزء الثاني المتماثل في مأدبة الغداء ونحن نتبادل الآراء وجها لوجه.
Есть все возможности обсудить практически все наиболее важные темы нашего сотрудничества.
هناك فرصة للمناقشة المفصلة لكافة المواضيع التي تهم الطرفين.
Я очень рад вас видеть. Добро пожаловать.
وسعيد جدا برؤيتكم فخامة الرئيس. أهلا وسهلا.
شكرا لكم سيادة الرئيس. وأنا سعيد اليوم أن أكون في موسكو ونلتقي لكي نناقش الكثير من الملفات الهامة المطروحة أمام دولتين.
Я тоже очень доволен пробивать в Москве сейчас и обсудить разные вопросы, которые перед нами.
صحيح أن اللقاء بين المسؤولين لا تنقطع بمختلف المستويات.
Действительно, встречи между разными чиновниками с обоих сторон, они не прекращаются.
ولكن تغيرات الدولية التي حصلت خلال العام الماضي قد تتطلب منا أن نلتقي ونضع تصورات مشتركة للمرحلة القادمة.
Ну, скорее всего, разные перемены, которые происходят на международной арене, вынуждают нас все чаще и чаще встречаться, чтобы понять, по какой рамке будем двигаться дальше.
Meet more and more often to outline the paths of our future cooperation.
الذي أصاب سوريا الشهر الماضي.
Сначала я хочу переадресовать слово спасибо как и вам, так и всем министерствам Российской Федерации, которые выражали свое отношение, которые присутствовали и помогали в воздействии землетрясения.
And who helped us to overcome the consequences of the earthquake.
الذي ساهم مساهمة مباشرة في إنقاذ المصابين في هذا الزلزال.
Также Минобороны Российской Федерации и экипажи военные, которые принимали непосредственное участие в эвакуации всех раненых с
Evacuating all the injured people, searching survivors from under the debris.
Это действительно повлияло на уменьшение количества как и жертв, так и раненых, и это помогло уменьшить также ущерб
To lessen the damage caused by the earthquake, to decrease the damage.
Также хочу отразить вам благодарность сирийского народа за вашу
Redirect the gratitude of the Syrian people for your firm position, firm stance of the Russian Federation on the international arena.
Эти позиции, которые исходят из суверенитета Сирийской Арабской Республики, единства ее земли, отражение террора и также отталкивание всех иностранных наземных вооруженных сил, которые там находятся.
Pushing away, sending away all the foreign armed forces that are present there.
Несмотря на то, что Россия сейчас также ведет спецоперацию,
despite Russia is now involved in its own special military operation, it still adheres to the same position, the same stance.
Сейчас я хочу воспользоваться моментом, потому что это мой первый визит после спецоперации на Украине.
Visit after the special operation in Ukraine.
Повторить сирийскую позицию в поддержку этой спецоперации против неонацистов и
military operation against the neo-Nazis and all Nazis.
قبل الحرب العالمية الثانية واحتضن قادتها بعد الحرب والآن هو يستمر في دعمهم كما كان سابقا.
And I'm saying that these are both old and new Nazis because the West, they had old type of Nazis in their lands before, and now they are supporting the new type of Nazis.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
They had old type of Nazis in their lands before, and now they are supporting the new type of Nazis.
Наша позиция не исходит только из-за дружбы между нами и
we are saying this, we are expressing this position not only because we have friendly relations, not only because we are loyal to you.
Наша позиция исходит от того, что мир действительно сейчас нуждается в страхе. Принимал старых нацистов у себя на земле, сейчас он стал их поддерживать в нынешнем. Я говорю, что это старые и новые нацисты. Принимал старых нацистов у себя на земле, сейчас он стал их поддерживать в нынешнем.
Type of Nazis in their lands before, and now they are supporting the new type of maps. And we are saying this, we are expressing this position not only because we have friendly relations, not only because we are loyal to you. We have this position because the world really needs stability now. Otherwise, it is going to cause some really large-scale disaster.
والذي كان من أفضل الاجتماعات التي تمت خلال السنوات الماضية.
And I'm very happy with the outcome of the meetings among our ministries in a couple of days that took place some days ago. I see them as some of the best meetings that we've had in the recent years. And I think about the results that were reached by both parties this time will help us to strengthen our financial and economic relations and to implement all the words, to turn all the words to practice. To real things. President, for this invitation. And once again, I would like to reiterate that this visit will help us to open a new aspect of our relations, future relations between Russia and Syria. And this visit will allow us to achieve real practical results that will help us to continue to build our cooperation in the future. So I suggest starting